We begin with a secret, a ghost story, pulled from the pages of a captured German officer's diary. The date is December 1943. The place, a frozen mountain in Italy called Monte La Difensa. The entry reads, "We don't see them, we only hear them." Or rather, we don't hear them. We just find the bodies in the morning, sentries with their throats slit, no sound of a struggle. They move like ghosts. The men are calling them the Schwarze Teufel, the Black Devils. In the frozen, unforgiving mountains of Italy, battle-hardened German soldiers, veterans of the brutal Eastern Front, began to fear the night. They stopped fearing the cold. They stopped fearing the artillery shells that could tear a man in half. They began to fear whispers. They began to fear shadows, because you can fight what you can see. But how do you fight something that isn't there? How do you kill a phantom that stalks your lines, an enemy that leaves only death and silence in its wake? This wasn't an army, it was a haunting. In those shadows hunted a new kind of soldier, a weapon forged in secrecy by two nations for one, almost suicidal purpose, to go where no one else could and to do the impossible. This is the story of the 1st Special Service Force, the unit so effective, so utterly terrifying, that the enemy gave them their name. This is the story of the Devil's Brigade. To understand what they became, you have to understand what they were. And they were never meant to be soldiers. Not in the traditional sense. In 1942, as the world burned, a strange call went out across North America. Not to the cities, not to the universities. It went to the wild, forgotten corners of the continent. The call was not for patriots or recruits eager for a uniform. It was for lumberjacks from the Pacific Northwest, miners from the Appalachian Mountains, park rangers who knew every secret of the Rockies, trappers and hunters from the Canadian wilderness. Think about that. Imagine the kind of man who chooses a life of hardship, a man who understands the brutal, simple logic of the wilderness, a man whose hands are already hard, whose eyes are already sharp, and whose soul is already comfortable with the quiet violence of survival. These were not blank slates to be molded into soldiers. They were already weapons. The army just needed to aim them. They were brought to a secret training facility in Helena, Montana, and there they were forged into something new, something lethal. The training was relentless, designed to break lesser men. They learned to ski like phantoms across the snow, to climb sheer mountain faces like spiders, to parachute from the sky like avenging angels. They mastered demolitions, learning to tear apart enemy infrastructure with cold, calculated precision. But most importantly, they were taught a different kind of combat, an older, more intimate kind. They were taught to kill, silently, efficiently, up close. Their signature weapon wasn't a rifle. It wasn't a machine gun, it was a knife. But even this was special. It was the V-42 Stiletto, a long, slender dagger, perfectly balanced, designed by their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Frederick. Look at it. It is not a utility tool. It's not a bayonet for a rifle. It's a whisper in the dark made of steel. The handle was wrapped in leather for a perfect grip, even when wet with snow or blood. The pommel was sharpened to a point designed for skull-crushing blows. And the blade was designed for one silent purpose, to slide between the ribs of an unsuspecting sentry and leave nothing but a gasp. This was not a soldier's weapon. It was an assassin's tool, and every man in the force mastered it. They were a brotherhood of shadows, a mix of the toughest Americans and the hardiest Canadians, united under one command, trained for one mission: infiltration and annihilation. They had the men, they had the training, they had the weapon. Now all they needed was a war and a legend to build. A legend that would be written not in ink, but in fear, because they were about to be unleashed upon an enemy who had no idea what was coming. An enemy who thought they were safe behind their fortified lines, secure in their mountain fortresses. They were wrong. They were about to learn the true meaning of the night. But their greatest weapon was not the V-42 dagger. It wasn't their explosives or their mastery of the mountains. Their greatest weapon was fear. And they wielded it with the precision of a surgeon. Before a raid, a ritual would take place. The men would gather in the darkness, and using tins of black boot polish, they would erase their faces. Smearing the thick, greasy polish over their skin, They became something other than human. They became faceless specters, their eyes gleaming out of the void. They weren't just camouflaging themselves, they were putting on a death mask. They were becoming the Black Devils. Imagine this. You are a German soldier, huddled in a freezing foxhole in the Italian mud. You've survived Russia. You've survived Africa. You believe you are tough. You believe you are safe. Your machine gun nest is positioned perfectly. Your sentries are alert. But then, in the dead of night, you hear nothing. Absolutely nothing. That's what's terrifying. The sudden silence. The machine gun that was chattering a minute ago is now quiet. You send a man to check. He doesn't come back. You call out. Only the wind answers. The men of the 1st Special Service Force would slip behind enemy lines, not for a major assault, but to conduct a campaign of pure psychological terror. They moved in small teams, like packs of wolves. A German patrol would be operating 1 minute and simply vanish the next. Sentries would be found at their posts in the morning, slumped over, with no sign of a struggle, no sound of an alarm. Just the cold steel of a V-42 that had done its work. And then came the calling card. The final brutal touch of psychological genius. On the bodies of the men they killed, on the doors of buildings in German-held towns, even sometimes on the fortifications themselves, they would leave a sticker. A small piece of paper that carried more weight than a bomb. It showed their unit's red spearhead insignia and a simple, chilling message in perfect German, Das dicke Ende kommt noch. It translates to, the worst is yet to come. Think about the corrosive power of that message. It is not a boast, it is a promise. You find your comrades dead, and this sticker is on their helmet. The message is clear. We were here. We could have killed you too. We can get to you anytime we want. And what we just did to your friends? That was nothing. That was just the beginning. The worst is yet to come. This was mental poison. It seeped into the morale of the German troops, spreading faster than any disease. Entire German units would fire wildly into the darkness, wasting ammunition on shadows. Reports were filled with mentions of the Black Devils. They were fighting 2 wars, one against the Allied armies and another against the ghosts in their own minds. And they were losing the war against the ghosts. This was a new kind of warfare. It wasn't about capturing territory. It was about capturing the enemy's imagination. It was about breaking a man's will to fight, making him terrified of his own shadow. The Devil's Brigade owned the night, and they made sure the Germans knew it. Their reputation grew, whispered from one terrified soldier to another. But a reputation is one thing. A legend requires something more. It requires an impossible act. And in the winter of 1943, the Allies were facing an impossible obstacle. It was called the Winter Line, a chain of German fortifications carved into the brutal mountainous spine of Italy. It was a fortress of rock and steel, designed to bleed the Allied advance dry. And the key to the entire line, the linchpin of the German defense, was a mountain called Monte La Difensa. The press called it the unclimbable mountain. It wasn't a slope. It was a sheer 1,000-foot cliff of jagged rock, watched over by German machine guns from its peak. Conventional Allied forces had tried to take the complex. They had thrown men and machines at its base, only to be slaughtered on the rocks below. The Germans considered the cliffs an impassable wall. The fortress at the top was untouchable, impregnable. They felt safe. And when a mission is impossible, when conventional armies have failed, who do you call? You call the men who were created for the impossible. You call the men who climb mountains in the dark. You call the Devil's Brigade. The mission they were given was simple in its insanity. While other Allied units created a diversion, a noisy, bloody distraction at the base of the mountain, the force would do what the Germans believed couldn't be done. They would climb the sheer cliff face at night, in the freezing cold, and take the fortress from the one direction no one was watching, the direction of impossibility. The night of December 2nd, 1943, a freezing wind whipped through the Italian mountains. As Allied artillery began to pound the base of Monte La Difensa, the Germans took their positions, ready for another futile head-on assault. They peered down into the darkness, watching the muzzle flashes, confident in their superior position. They never once thought to look straight down, because straight down was the devil's path. Under the cover of the shelling's roar, the 1st Special Service Force began their ascent. This was not a military operation. It was a feat of pure human will against nature. They didn't use conventional climbing gear. They used ropes, their bare, freezing hands, and the one tool that never left their side, the V-42 dagger. They would jam the points of their stilettos into tiny cracks in the rock face, using them as handholds, pulling themselves up inch by agonizing inch. Imagine the silence, the discipline. For hours they climbed, each man responsible for the life of the man below him. One slip, one falling rock, one cry of pain, and the entire mission would be compromised. The Germans on the summit would rain down fire and turn the cliff face into a vertical tomb. They climbed in total darkness, feeling their way up the rock, the boot polish on their faces a grim testament to their purpose. They were no longer men. They were shadows scaling a wall of stone, ascending towards a sleeping enemy. After hours of grueling, silent effort, the first of the forcemen pulled themselves over the ledge at the summit, utterly undetected. The German soldiers in their bunkers were sleeping, huddled for warmth, secure in their impregnable fortress. The attack that followed was not a battle. It was an execution. It was swift, it was brutal, and it was a complete and total shock. The Devil's Brigade fell upon the German positions with the fury of a storm, their Thompson submachine guns and V-42 daggers creating a storm of controlled chaos. The Germans, waking from sleep to find black-faced devils in their midst, were thrown into absolute panic. There was no organized defense. There was only terror and death. The Devil's Brigade took the summit of Monte La Difensa in 2 hours, a feat that military strategists had predicted would take weeks and cost thousands of lives, if it was even possible at all. They had climbed the unclimbable mountain. They had taken the untakeable fortress. The legend was no longer a whisper. It was now a roar that echoed through the Allied and Axis high commands. The story of the Devil's Brigade did not end on that mountain. They fought with savage distinction through the rest of the Italian campaign, leading the charge into Rome. At the Anzio beachhead, they held a line that was supposed to be held by an entire division, conducting terrifying night raids that decimated German morale. But like many elite specialized units, their time was short. In the broad, grinding endgame of the war, their unique skills were no longer deemed necessary. The 1st Special Service Force was officially disbanded in December 1944, their mission complete. They had never failed to take an objective, but their legacy is immortal, because the story did not truly end there. The tactics of deep infiltration, of psychological warfare, of combining the best soldiers from different nations into a single elite unit, that became the blueprint for almost all modern special forces. The United States Army's legendary Green Berets trace their lineage directly back to the men of the force. Canada's elite counterterrorism unit, Joint Task Force 2, sees them as their forefathers. The spirit of the Devil's Brigade lives on today in the shadows, in the world's most dangerous places, embodied by the quiet professionals who do the impossible. They were a brief, brutal, brilliant chapter in the history of the Second World War. A phantom unit born of desperation, who haunted the nightmares of the Third Reich and changed the very definition of what a soldier could be. They were lumberjacks and miners. They were Americans and Canadians. They were the 1st Special Service Force. They were the Devil's Brigade. What do you think was the most effective part of their legend? Their tactics, their weapon, or their psychological warfare? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The history of war is filled with stories like this, hidden in the archives, waiting to be told. If you want to uncover more of them, make sure to subscribe to Hidden War Archives and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, share this video. Thank you for watching.